There's this question that philosopher Thomas Nagel asks of bats. He says, "Is there something it's like to be a bat?" And it's like a good question for us to think through whether something's conscious or not. Is my dog conscious? Well, is there something it's like to be him? And I wanted to apply this to the Trinity and see if we could. And maybe it's inappropriate, but is there something that it's like to be the Son that is distinct from what it's like to be the Father, and the Spirit likewise? And then is there something it's like to be God? What do you make of that? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is another very special one. I have with me Dr. Lane Tipton, and we're going to be talking about his new book, The Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til. It's awesome. It's a Reform Forum book. Big shout out to Camden for sending it to me. And this is the book adaptation of Dr. Tipton's dissertation, which is The Triune Personal God, the Trinitarian Theology, and the Thought of Cornelius Van Til, which has been like an underground dissertation amongst Van Til folks for a while, where we trying to get it and sneak it around and email it to each other. So I'm really excited this book's coming out. I'm really excited to be talking with Dr. Tipton. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen by being a Patreon patron. If you guys like this podcast, you want to see me continue doing this, continue having scholars on, continue doing the hard work of reading books beforehand, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can join for as little as $3 a month and as much as like $100 a month, which would be insane. You can also support the podcast by buying some merch from the Parker's Pensées merch store. You can find the link in the description, or if you're on YouTube, you can find that in the store tab somewhere over there. And then third way, if you're watching on YouTube, there's a super chat button down here, a super thanks button. And if you want to buy me a cup of coffee or whatever, that'd be cool too. So thank you for all the support of all the patrons. And please, if you're not already, please consider becoming one. Without further ado, then, let's bring in Dr. Tipton and let's get going on Cornelius Van Til, the Autotheos of the Son, Perichoresis, all sorts of good stuff like that. We're going to help you understand those words. So here we go. Dr. Tipton, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Parker, it's a delight to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely, man. I'm very excited, as I said, to have this book and be able to tell people where they can get it now without feeling guilty about secretly having your dissertation or anything like that. Before we jump in on the specifics of the book and Van Til, I just wanted to ask, how'd you get into Van Til? You spent a huge portion of your intellectual life, writing a dissertation on his Trinitarian theology. How'd that happen? How'd you get into his theology?
Well, I became interested in Van Til pretty soon after I was converted in Amarillo, Texas, and began reading him and trying to understand him. And soon after that, we moved to Abilene, Texas, and I joined an Orthodox Presbyterian church there within about 6 months of being converted. And the pastor there was a graduate of Westminster Seminary. His name was Neil Lodge, and he was quite interested in Van Til. And so my interest continued to grow. I met my beautiful wife, Charlene, there in Abilene. We wound up going to Westminster, California. And at Westminster, California, two people in particular were really strong proponents of Van Til, Meredith Klein and Robert Strimple. And they just fueled my interest in Van Til. And by the time in 1998, when we moved to Westminster in Philadelphia, I was under Dr. Gaffin in systematic theology. And the story, I don't know how many people know this, but I originally wanted to write a dissertation on Pauline Christology, Colossians 1, 15 through 20, and do some work on the processional relations of personal origin, 15a, some of the implications of that for image endowment, resurrection, consummation, things like that.
Yeah.
Gaffin told me I needed to do a dissertation on Van Til and probe the deep structures of his Trinitarian theology And he really, I won't say forced me because he's not a forceful man,
Yeah.
but he insisted that I pursue that, and then other things could come later. So I really owe it to Dr. Gaffin for pushing me decisively to
Yeah.
spend the time reading Van Til and probing the background and influences and nature and structure and implications of his Trinitarian theology back in
Yeah.
1998.
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited about it because so often presuppositional apologetics, trying to understand Van Til and his thought, and people watering it down and getting all the way down and to the popular level without people get there without understanding his theology. And this he's a churchman, he was a theologian, so I'm excited to get into his Trinitarian theology because it's like the heart of his apologetics, the heart of his philosophy and theology. So this is a tough question, I guess, but it'll take us the rest of the time to explain it. What is Van Til's doctrine of the Trinity? Would you say the self-contained Trinity uh, encompasses his whole doctrine, or is that just a part of it? What would you make of that?
Well, the genius of Van Til's Trinitarian theology is that he forges a unique and distinctive integration of classical Reformed Trinitarianism and classical Reformed federalism.
Mm,
That's the key.
mm,
In other words, it's not just an abstract affirmation of the ontological Trinity in himself, wholly apart from the systematic implications of his pluriform relations to the world. Rather, Van Til is self-consciously seeking to avoid all forms of what's called correlativism,
yeah,
making God and the creature interdependent in a mutually constituting relation. And so I think the best way to get at what Van Til's after is that he is integrating a Calvinistic Trinitarian theology through the influences of the continental Dutch tradition,
mm,
Bavinck in particular, the old Princeton tradition, A. Hodge and Voss, especially in particular. And then he's self-consciously seeking to integrate a distinctive Reformed theology of the Trinity to a classical conception of covenant theology, image and
mhm,
covenant, that he learned from Voss. And he's always seeking to apply it to ancient, medieval, or modern species of correlativism,
mhm,
whereby God is either changing and taking on the mode of the creature and mutating, denying simplicity, denying immutability. He's opposed to that with all of his soul.
yeah,
Or the creature being reproportioned to God, which you find in traditional Roman Catholic theology. So that's the way I would put it, Parker, in terms of it's the integration of classical Reformed Trinitarianism and classical Reformed federalism in a self-conscious, distinctive package,
yeah,
theological package of the creator-creature relation.
yeah, and it's fantastic. I particularly love his appropriation of oh man, I just forgot of Bavinck. Holy cow! Everyone's gonna
Oh,
hammer
no,
me
no,
for
no
that.
worries, no
My
worries.
goodness. But so everyone loves Bavinck today. But you say, well, how about Van Til? No, not Van Til. Like, well, I mean, he's just using Bavinck. But what's fascinating is that I think he's trying to advance Bavinck, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. If not advance, at least explain more thoroughly as he's interacting with Hodge and Voss. He's putting them together. Is he being is he being creative? I know that's kind of like a scary word in theology. You don't want to be creative because we're a historical faith. Is he being creative, or what do you make of that fusion that he's utilizing using?
Well,
Making?
that's a great question, Parker. I think you can say that he is constructive
Okay.
as an Orthodox Trinitarian theologian.
Yeah.
So he's an Orthodox Trinitarian theologian who's constructive. And where is the constructive propension most clearly seen? Well, here's where it's seen. Van Til is not seeking merely to advance the continental Dutch tradition of Bavinck.
Yeah.
He's not seeking merely to advance the old Princeton English Puritan tradition that he learned from Voss, who's himself Dutch, but operating in that context of Princeton, or the Hodges or others. He's rather seeking to present the two streams of historic Orthodox Trinitarianism and covenant theology in an integrated way that shows the unique and internal genius of Reformed theology over against Roman Catholicism or modernist errors, post-Enlightenment errors. So I would not. I would say that Van Til is constructive as an Orthodox theologian, and the creativity where I think he's most creative is not technically in his doctrine of the Trinity simpliciter,
Yeah.
but in its application, the application of the Trinity to image and covenant, what he calls the representational principle, and its bearing on the apologetical method that grows organically from that theology. That's
Yeah.
where I think it's in the application to um, to covenant theology and to method where you see the more creative propensions. But what is it? It's taking standard, well-worn paths of Trinitarianism from both the continental Dutch and English Puritan traditions, and then seeking consistently to
Mm.
apply that.
Yeah, that's really good. There's this language that you use, which I really like that you bring it back in, or that you don't hide from it, I guess, is absolute personality, and I really like this language a lot. Can you help us with it? Like so the triune God is absolute personality. What work's being done by those words? What does that mean?
Yeah, deal with that, especially from Bavinck. Van Til there's zero originality on that,
Right, right.
because he's inheriting that from Bavinck. A couple of ways to try to get at it. You could think of it this way. When Van Til, following Bavinck, wants to speak of absolute personality, Bavinck is insistent that God's unity is not abstract and impersonal. God's unity, rather, expresses itself or exists. I shouldn't say expresses itself. God's unity exists in a threefold subsistence.
Yeah.
The Father subsists as the entire divine essence, the Son subsists as the entire divine essence, the Spirit subsists as the entire divine essence. And so there is no impersonal or abstract or non unity of God. That's point number one.
Yeah.
And within the Trinity mean that God's unity is a tripersonal unity. The second thing, and I think Bavinck says this, and A.A. Hodge says this in his commentary on the Confession, and I think this is easily overlooked, but Bavinck and Hodge, and Van Til picks up on this, say that God is a self-existent being,
Hmm.
a self-willing being, a self-conscious being. So it's not that there are these three independent centers of consciousness and will in God. That's tritheism. That's
Yeah.
death.
Yeah.
That's a tremendous, that's a heresy. Rather, God in his unity knows, wills, and acts. Yes, there are terminal personal uh, dimensions to his acting, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But in his unity, God is self existent, self conscious, and knows in the unity of his being. And Bavinck especially says that is partly why we want to talk about an absolute personality. So when you put it all together, and I hint at this, don't hint at it, I think I say this, don't remember the page number, but I say that probably the fullest way to speak of absolute personality to avoid confusion is an absolute triune
Mhm.
personality.
Yeah.
And there, of course, we're wanting to affirm the unity of simplicity. We're wanting to affirm the incommunicable personal properties, the subsistent relations, and the coherent relations. All of those together help us understand that God is an absolute triune personality without committing the error of modalism on
Yeah.
the one side, denying the personal distinctions, or without committing the error of tritheism on the other side, separating the persons and positing some kind of mute essence or something like that.
Yeah. That's so helpful that you mentioned those two heresies. So, in Trinitarian studies, there's it's more complex than this, but oftentimes people will point to like the Latin model of the Trinity, which people argue errs more on the side of modalism. That it looks like God's just wearing three different masks, but he's really just one person. And then the social model, which people say, well, look, that seems like there's three separate beings, and that seems like tritheism. And
Mhm.
so the goal is to not do that. And historically, the doctrine has been right there in the middle. When it comes to consciousness, there's this question that philosopher Thomas Nagel asks of bats. He says, "Is there something it's like to be a bat?" And it's like a good question for us to think through whether something's conscious or not. Is my dog conscious? Well, is there something it's like to be him? And I wanted to apply this to the Trinity and see if we could. And maybe it's inappropriate, but is there something that it's like to be the Son that is distinct from what it's like to be the Father, and then and the Spirit likewise? And then is there something it's like to be God? What do you make of that? Is that an inappropriate question, I guess?
Well, I would never come on your show and say, Parker, that's an inappropriate question, sir.
That's
But let me put it this way: there
yeah.
are when and I deal with this in the third chapter, especially of the revised book, the Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til. There are three incommunicable personal properties in the Godhead
Okay.
that do not deny or eclipse divine simplicity. The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Spirit there's a spirating of the Spirit from the Father and the Son. Now, those are three irreducibly unique, incommunicable properties. The Son is not unbegotten, and the Father is not begotten,
Yeah.
etc., etc., etc. So, when we're talking about the Trinity, and you ask the question, "What's it like to be the Father?"
Hmm.
It's to be unbegotten,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What's it like to be the Son? It's to be begotten of the Father from all eternity. What's it like to be the Spirit? It's to proceed from the Father and the Son from all eternity. And you cannot confuse or conflate or apply those properties to the whole Godhead. You
Yeah.
can't apply one property to the other persons.
Yeah.
Now that means then that there are incommunicable personal properties within a simple and undivided essence. So how do we relate them? Well, this is the way we do it. Those distinct and incommunicable personal properties are also modes of relation to the essence.
Okay.
The Father, as unbegotten, subsists entirely as the undivided essence. The Son, as eternally begotten, subsists entirely as the divine essence. So that while the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Father is entirely God, and the Son is entirely God.
Mhm.
And when you start thinking of it that way, we're going to reach, we already have, Parker. This
Yeah.
is the instant that our creaturehood hits us. We have to recognize it's incomprehensible to the creature how such can be the case, but it is an entailment of biblical teaching, an entailment of classical creedal theology, ecumenical creedal theology, lowercase c Catholic theology, and it's an entailment of Reformed confessional theology.
Yeah.
So, does the Son know himself as the Son, who is God? Yes. Does the Father know himself as the Father, who is not the Son? Yes. But what happens so often, and I try to avoid this in the dissertation and in this book, is that we can never think of consciousness as an independent center
Mm.
that segregates person from person or person from essence. And so the way to get at that question intelligibly is to get in place incommunicable personal properties, which are then relations of subsistence, and recognize we can affirm true distinctions among the persons along the lines I just suggested, yet an absolute identity of person to essence.
Mm.
And by the way, once you put it that way, you can come back around. This kind of feeds back to the Bavinck question you asked about. That's where absolute personality really is put on grand display. It's such a concrete Trinitarian category that, the tendency is to say, are there four persons?
Yeah.
And is that fourth person, is that a heresy? No, no, not at all. Once you understand these basic categories, which Van Til points you to in Hodge, which I have in the book, it really does start to open up the profound mystery of Orthodox Trinitarianism. So
Yeah.
that's the best shot I can take at it, Parker.
That's really good. That's really helpful. So when it comes to like the external operations of the Trinity, they're I always mess up the Latin, so I'm not going to try it, but um, there's a unity of the external operations of the Trinity, and yet the Father wasn't crucified. The Father didn't take on flesh, and so we're messing with the deepest mysteries in the universe here. So no pressure, but what how do we think through the fact that the external operations are unified, that there are not three unique, completely wholly distinct centers of consciousness, though there are three unique modes of relation to the essence. um, it seems like there's such a strong unity here that we might have some trouble with the Son acting on his own in being incarnated, in uh, being on the cross and dying for our sins. Do you see what I'm like gesturing at here?
Oh, sure, sure. I think we can say something like this, that matching the undivided unity of the divine essence and the processions of personal origin within the Trinity, the processional relations of personal origin,
Hmm.
um, which, of course, when we speak in that way, we're not talking in creaturely categories. We're simply speaking in terms of personal existence among persons who are God
Yeah.
in themselves from all eternity. But just as the Son is generated by the Father from all eternity, so the Son is sent by the Father
Hmm.
to accomplish the historical mission after the fall of redemption in his humiliation and exaltation. So, one way to try to get at it is that the works of God ad extra,
Hmm.
outside of himself. The processions are works ad intra, they terminate in God. The works of creation and providence and redemption are ad extra, they terminate outside of God, they fall in time. I think we could say something like this, and it's important to say, as St. Augustine said, all of the works of God ad extra are one.
Yeah.
All of them. They cannot be divided.
Hmm.
So in from that standpoint, God creates, God redeems,
Yeah.
God consummates. Yet within that undivided unity, there are personal works of a terminal sort.
Mm.
So I can put it in a really popular way in light of Ephesians 1. The Father elects, the Son redeems, the Spirit applies that redemption.
Yeah.
Or to put it in a way that I think might be more useful to our listeners, the while it is God who saves sinners, the unique terminal act of the accomplishment of that redemption is the Son, who
Mm.
is essentially inseparable from the Father, but personally distinct from the Father. And so that inseparable unified action finds a personal terminus
Yeah.
in the Son. And this, once again, in the economy, illustrates what we were saying about incommunicable personal properties, modes of subsistence, and an inseparable divine essence who, as inseparable at the same time, has these three distinct modes of subsistence:
Yeah.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so it's there's a fine line when you're talking about this, but the works of God are one, in ad intra and ad extra, but there are distinctive personal acts of a terminal sort, ad intra and ad extra.
Yeah.
And the Father's unbegotten, Son's begotten, Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son ad intra. The Father um, ordains in a unique way. The Son redeems, accomplishes in a unique way. The Spirit applies in a unique way. And these are, I think, illustrative of the incommunicable personal properties and the unique or distinctive personal agency of each person who is the one undivided God.
Yeah. So what's so fascinating here? This is so cool. So ad intra for the folks listening at home. It just means like internal to the Godhead. So um, ad intra, there's these modes of relation. The Father's unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit is spirated or proceeds from the two. If we're Westerners, um, and then you can match those up with the external works. And so when you do that, sometimes people get into this trouble of eternal functional subordination or ESS, eternal subordination of the Son, because you say, look, there's these ontological things going on inside the Trinity which necessitate that the Son was the one who was sent and not the Father. And then you mess with like, well, is the Father more ontologically basic than the Son? And if so, then do we have a hierarchy in the Godhead? And so what you do in following Van Til, or at least explicating what Van Til is doing following Calvin, is bringing up the doctrine of Autotheos, which is so fascinating. It's so cool that it's working here. Can you explain just what that term means before we jump in on it?
Sure, that the Son's essence is neither derived nor sustained by another.
Yeah, it's so good. So Voss like denies the language of the fountain of deity, that the Father is like overflowing his deity into the Son, and then it goes from both of them to the Spirit. And Van Til denies similarly, following Voss, denies the communication of the essence from the Father to the Son. And so since the essence isn't communicated to the Son, but he has it of himself, uh, we don't have to worry about EFS or ESS at all, because it's not like the Son's ontologically deriving his being from the Father. Does that sound right?
Oh, Parker, I think that's quite astute of you, sir. I don't enter into that discussion or debate in the book,
Yeah.
but the cleanest, clearest, most programmatic acts to the root of ESS is an autothean conception of the Son's person.
Yeah.
That there is no sense in which he is ontologically subordinate to the Father, because in his essence is neither communicated nor sustained by another.
Yeah.
And Van Til is following Calvin, he's following Warfield,
Mm.
he's following Voss. And I do think that this is one of the most underappreciated doctrines of John Calvin. I think
Yeah.
if people were more robust in their um, understanding of being Calvinist, I think this would probably be at the center, because this is a very distinctive attempt of Calvin to be thoroughly Nicene,
Yeah.
to be full orbed in the doctrine of simplicity, and to avoid any conception of a derived or dependent deity in the Son. And so, as Van Til says, one of the chief heresies in the church is the doctrine of subordinationism, which is
Yeah.
precisely what you find in the debate you're referencing. And Autotheos is, I think, the strongest antidote to that venom.
Yeah. So what's really fascinating here is that we have these irreducible unique properties. The Son's irreducible unique property is being begotten, and it's a way to individuate the persons of the Trinity. And it's we believe that God's revealed himself to be that way, so it's not just something ad hoc. But
Right.
those who do go in for the fountain of deity language, they can say, well, look, they can explain begottenness pretty easily by just saying, look, the Father is the fountain of all being, and so the Son is begotten. His essence has flown out of the Father. Um, and we say, no, that's not right, and we're following Calvin. The Son is autotheos, and I think that makes sense. With that in mind, though, how do we explain the Son being begotten? Because we need that. We need that incommunicable property in order to individuate the Son from the Father and the Spirit. And yet, since we don't go in for the fountain of being language, we don't have it as clean of a story, I guess. Is it just that, the Father has revealed it? And not just, if God reveals it, then he reveals it. But do we have any more to say, or do we just say, God has revealed it such that we can understand that the Son is begotten, even though we don't have the ontology that the others would have?
Well, a couple of thoughts on this. I think when you start to ask a systematic question, things start to become clearer.
Okay.
And it's this. And by the way, the Brandon Ellis's work on this, which I don't know if I think I have it in a footnote, but his work, Calvin, Classical Trinitarianism, and the Aseity of the Son,
Yeah.
is a delightful study, and he'll indicate that Calvin's view did not become the majority report even among all of the Reformed.
Hmm.
And so, we need to be aware of that.
Okay.
Francis Turretin probably takes a middling way. Warfield, Voss, and others affirm this. Van Til is clearly influenced from the work of Calvin, Warfield, and Voss on this particular point. So it's not as though the denial of autothean personhood is a heresy. That's certainly not the case. But here's the point that might be useful. The relation of generation is one of personal differentiation. It's an
Uh-huh.
order of personal existence.
Okay.
And that eternal relation of differentiation is the unfolding for our understanding of a Trinitarian Godhead, a three-personed Godhead.
Yeah.
The Father is communicative with respect to the Son's person, but even in his person, the Son is not purely passive. He's not just a pure passive product
Yeah.
of the Father. There's a reciprocity, a co-inhering, a communion that is active on both sides. And I think Calvin's view, once you recognize that it's not pure activity from the Father and a pure passive reception from the Son, but living personal communion among those who are fully God of themselves. Uh, I think that's what Calvin's after. Now, the systematic issue that I think helps people is this. And it's a thesis that I have been developing for some time. I have it at certain portions of the book, Parker.
Yeah.
One of these days I'll write more on it. But Thomas Aquinas affirms the communication of the essence in the act of eternal generation.
Yeah.
And just because he does that, and he's explicit about this, the processional relations provide the archetype for the creator-creature relation.
Yeah.
And the creature, Adam, in the work of special creation for Thomas Aquinas, in the work of exitus in creation, he is created outside God and imperfectly and indirectly participates in the essence of God.
Hmm.
When the donum is given, it inaugurates and initiates an ascending participation in the essence of God that reproportions Adam above his nature to participate in the essence of God, ultimately to view intelectively, to view directly and without mediation the essence of God.
Yeah, the beatific that's what he would call the beatific vision then.
That's what
Yeah.
and that's Thomas's view, which Bavinck calls a melting union. He calls it an erasure of the creator-creature distinction. But here's the key: that Thomas and the traditional Roman Catholics who follow him make the communication of the essence in the Trinity the ground for ascending participation of the essence through nature, creation,
Mhm.
grace, donum, and its consummation in the light of glory. And Van Til, following Bavinck, following Voss, following the classical Reformed tradition, says the creature is not participating in the essence of God and in need of the donum superadditum. The creature is rather created in personal religious fellowship with God as a creature and needs only the special providential terms of the covenant for that personal fellowship between the creator and the creature to consummate.
Mm.
Without this notion of ascending participation and being reproportioned above human nature,
Yeah.
supernatural grace reproportions above human nature. Covenant brings a full actualization to human nature, but never elevates it above
Mm.
its status as human nature. And so, if you look at it from that path, here's what I think, Parker.
Yeah.
And I sketched this out the best I can in the book. Van Til sees that connection and is trying to say that the Trinitarianism and federalism he's presenting stand over against the deeper Catholic conception in its conception of Trinitarian processions and in its two-stage doctrine, actually three-stage, but two-stage nature, grace, and glory. It's ascending participation in the essence of God that requires, in Voss's terms, for Rome, a Pelagian conception of nature, a sacerdotal conception of grace, and a full-orbed mystical conception of consummation.
Yeah.
So it's that. Ellis. Please look at Ellis. Read Warfield on the fine points of autothean personhood, but recognize that I think the genius of Van Til is that he's applying the non-communication of essence in the Trinitarian processions to an analogical replica of personal fellowship
Mm.
and not a participation of essence.
Yeah. That I'm waiting for that Ellis book to not be $1 billion there. I want that book, man. They need to make a soft cover.
I hate to tell you, I got it for around, I found a used copy of it about 8 or so years ago. I don't remember quite how long, for like $30.
Oh
I feel
man.
terrible. I almost feel guilty.
You should. Well, so with that participation in the divine essence, I see you helped me see it more clearly that is an impersonalist view of the divine nature, as if it were some like a swimming pool you could just dip into or something. But Van Til, following the Dutch and old Princeton, are saying there is no impersonality in God. You can't just participate in God, in the divine nature, as if it were an impersonal thing that you can just be in, because he's tri-personal, and there's no extra area for a human being to be in. Does that make sense? Does that sound about right?
Well, yeah, I will say this. Emery has a book, strangely entitled something close to mine, The Trinitarian Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm.
And one thing that he does note is that the participation in the essence of God is also a participation in the processions, that
Ah.
the missions of the Son and Spirit in Reditus are to return the church to their participation in the essence of God and their return to the Father,
Mm.
so that the more robust forms of and I think Thomas teaches this too. I think Emery is probably the best interpreter of Thomas, in my opinion.
Okay.
I don't think he's been superseded right now among current interpreters, but there are a lot of good ones. They make explicit that the exitus reditus of the creature follows the exitus reditus of the Son and the Spirit in the processions. And the mission of the Son and Spirit ultimately is to bring about a participation in their processional return to the Father.
Mm.
So it on that level, they're not just trying to say it's an abstract, impersonal essence, but they're going so far as to say that the missions affect a participation in the processional reditus
Yeah.
of the Son and Spirit. But anyway, you slice that. Let me just put it this way:
Yeah.
it's in the book, and I don't know if I feature this as much as I could because it's not a critique of Rome per se.
Sure.
But Westminster Confession 26:3 is explicit that creatures in no wise, not in any way, partake of the substance of the Godhead.
Yeah.
Not in creation, not in redemption. And the if anyone's interested, I'll just plug his book. He'll blush at this, but
Yeah.
Camden has a wonderful exposition of precisely what the conformity to the divine nature looks like.
Mm.
It's in his book on Ronner
Oh, awesome.
that was published by P&R, but I'll try to find it. I'm looking
Mm.
for it right now.
Yeah.
Um, Francis Turretin has a wonderful discussion of that in his um, Institutes of Eclectic Theology, and it is in. Let me see if I can find it.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah. The third topic, question 4, in I believe it's volume 3. He says this. This is just brief. He
Yeah.
says believers are said to be partakers of the divine nature, not univocally by a formal participation of the divine essence. That's the Roman Catholic view,
Okay.
but only analogically by the benefit of regeneration, which impresses upon them the marks of holiness and righteousness, most properly belonging to God, since they are renewed after the image of their Creator. Thus, we must understand what often occurs in the Fathers when they speak of the renewed man and the man made conformable to God, not essentially, which applies to the Son only,
Mhm.
but analogically. So that's Turretin from his institute's third topic, question 6. And I think that is a really helpful way to remember that the view. And by the way, I've got an essay out on this in Reformed Forum that the magazine,
Yeah.
the update, that can explain some of this further. But there's a different conception of beatitude and what it means to be conformed to the divine nature in the Reformed versus the Roman Catholic, simply because there is a difference when it comes to ultimately communication of essence in the processions, participation of essence in creation, and the ascending elevation of the creature above that essence, that creaturely essence, in the beatific vision.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fantastic. Yeah, so like you said, either way you cut it, whether there is an impersonalistic, there's an idea of an impersonal divine nature, or whether you're caught up in the actual processions, which seems like it's an ad intra thing. It's a scare.
Mhm.
It's a scary, kind of crazy thought. Um, to me, at
Very,
least.
very different
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
Reformed.
So in the Reform view, there's an emphasis on the creator-creature distinction, which would say, no, look, there's no more. You don't proceed back up in ad intra into the Trinity. I wonder. This is kind of taking us maybe not too far afield, but a little bit afield of the book. So no worries if you don't want to get into it. But I wonder, when it comes to being image bearers of God, we're imaging God, in an analogical fashion. Do we image um do we image the Trinity in any particular way? I know we don't want to get into, like, well, look at my psychology, and we don't want to go like the Augustinian route, probably, and saying uh we're an analogy for the Trinity. But do we image the triune God as individual image bearers?
Well, it's interesting that you would raise that, because the from the quote that Turretin just gave, he references the image language from Ephesians 4:24
Okay.
and Colossians 3:10, and the reference there is to be being renewed in 4:24 in true righteousness and holiness in the image of God. It's not in the image of the Father.
Mm,
It's not in the image of the Son. It's not in the image of the Holy Spirit. And in 3:10, renewed in the knowledge of the Creator. And so there, we have to recognize this, that those texts make it unambiguous that the image bearer, whether it's pre-fall or post-fall, is made in the image of the triune God. Now, one complementary thing to say, though,
mhm.
there is a sense in which Jesus Christ, as incarnate, has brought the assumed Adamic image, which is created in the likeness of the triune God. He has brought that through his suffering and glory to eschatological perfection.
Mm.
And Paul can say in Romans 8:29 and 1 Corinthians 15:49 that we are being conformed to the image of Christ.
Yeah.
And in 15:49, we will bear the image of Christ when our bodies are raised at the end of this age.
Mhm.
Now, that's not competitive with being created in the image of the Trinity. Here's what's being said,
Yeah.
that just as Adam was created in the image of the Trinity in an estate of probation that never reached glory,
Yeah.
Jesus assumed that image as the last Adam,
Mhm.
and through his suffering has now, by resurrection and ascension, seen its perfecting to glory.
Mm.
And so we are bearing now and being renewed in the image of the triune God as it through redemption has been perfected in the incarnate and glorified Christ.
Yeah.
So that's one way to try to put those two concerns together, because some people will say, well, which is it? Well, it's both.
Yeah.
And in that order, though, the image of the triune God brought now to perfection through the second and last Adam in his humiliation and exaltation, which is now being conferred upon the church, and we are being conformed to that glorious, perfected, eschatological image.
That's so awesome, man. That's you've really connected a lot of dots for me here. This is awesome. So that's why, Christ is he's the last Adam or the second Adam. That's why you're either under Adam or you're under Christ. And I
Yes.
think you fleshing that out just is way more helpful because I mean I've always affirmed that, but it's actually helped me understand. I don't know if it's ontologically or not, but you've helped me understand in a more deep way why why being under Adam is such a big deal. Like, because there's all these debates on whether we inherit guilt or just a corrupt nature and all this stuff. Or whatever, we can even circumscribe those. We can even get through those by just pointing out like Adam wasn't perfect. He wasn't created perfect, though he was created good, but he fell, and so all of us are either under him or the second Adam who assumed the same nature that Adam had, but perfected it through living a perfect righteous life. And it's so cool, man. We're being made into the image of Christ, who is in the perfected state.
Yeah,
As
Adam was sinless, but
yeah,
in an estate of innocency.
mhm,
Sinless, but under probation.
yeah,
Jesus, sinless and beyond probation
yeah,
and glorified. And
and
that's so, it makes all the difference. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I think it's helpful for Christians to understand that because Christ's forgiveness is not getting us back to the garden. It's not getting us
Yes.
back to Adam's state prior to the fall because that it was an imperfected state. It wasn't. Then we could fall again if we got back to that state. No, Christ assumed that and took it all the way. He scored the touchdown. We're not at the 1 yard line or whatever. I got some athletes that listen, so I'm trying to throw in something for them.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Scored the
So
touchdown than which none greater can be conceived.
that's there we go. Perfect. That's a clip. Um, so Dr.
Oh,
Tipton,
please don't.
yeah,
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
there's a doctrine that I went to TEDS, I went to Trinity, and
Mhm.
I loved my time there. But a doctrine that wasn't talked about a whole ton in these conversations is the doctrine of perichoresis.
Yeah.
And when it was usually talked about in regards to the Eastern fathers and stuff.
Mhm.
But Van Til uses perichoresis, and you do by way of Van Til to really help us understand this. I'll use the language and then I'll ask you to explain it. But I just pulled a quote: "The persons of the Trinity indwell one another in relations of mutual co-inherence or inherence." Can you help us out with that? Because I love perichoresis, but going to you to help us figure out what it means.
Sure. Van Til quotes from Charles Hodge, of course, and Hodge is, as is well known, very dependent on Turretin.
Mm,
And Danny Olinger has done some work on Voss, and Voss is quite dependent on Turretin in the writing of his Reformed dogmatics. And when Turretin is describing the classically Reformed doctrine of perichoresis, it's not about the relation of the person to the essence. Earlier,
mm,
25, 30 minutes ago, we talked about how each person subsists as the entire and undivided essence.
Yeah.
Those relations of subsistence are absolutely foundational to Trinitarian orthodoxy. It's why the persons aren't separate. It's
Mhm.
why the persons aren't detachable from the essence. Each person is that essence.
Yeah.
So the relation of person to essence is one of identity. Now, in the doctrine of perichoresis, Turretin says that each person not only subsists as the divine essence, but exhaustively permeates and mutually embraces the others.
Mm.
And so the concept there is that we, Parker, as image bearers, always exist in one way or another outside of one another.
Yeah.
We always will. It's the nature of, partly the nature of being a creature. But the persons of the Godhead, according to Turretin, exist in such a way that they exhaustively indwell one another from the interior of the other
Mm.
without their personal identities being lost. It is, by analogy, Hodge puts it this way, Turton puts it this way, it is the Trinitarian archetype of personal communion,
Mm.
where person indwells person. And that, most specifically, Parker, perichoresis, the reason it's so important is it brings into view the precise character of Trinitarian beatitude. What
Mm.
is the beatitude of the Father? It is the Son and Spirit in an exhaustive, mutual embrace of person to person that is entirely interior. It's absolutely ineffable and beyond comprehension. And my argument that I'm developing in the book,
Mhm.
that I think Van Til's suggesting, is that the precise replication, the special creation of Adam in the image of God, is in an analogical personal fellowship with God that reflects that perichoretic coherence.
Mm.
For Thomas and for the traditional Roman Catholic position, Adam has will, Adam has volition, but he's created outside of God. He needs, as Voss says, grace infused to achieve a religious relation.
Right.
But for the Reformed, perichoresis provides the unique Trinitarian referent for saying Adam was created in personal fellowship with God that consisted in worship.
Mm.
And so it's not only a beautiful doctrine of explaining the intra-Trinitarian relation of person to person, it's also the unique doctrinal or theological archetype for Adam's creation in the image of God and in covenant with God,
Yeah.
and how that personal relation is given from the alpha point by creation and can be brought to fruition and consummation through covenant with no need of this ontologically reproportioning grace.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's quite, and at the end of the book, I try to say, you know, Van Til's view here, the view I just explained, this perichoretic this reproduction of perichoretic communion in Adam as the image of God, reaches its fruition after the fall in Christ's ascension.
Mhm.
Um, that is what makes the Reformed doctrine of the creator-creature relation stand out in such sharp contrast to traditional Roman Catholicism
Yeah.
and modern neo-orthodoxy.
Mm.
We really do have here, Parker, and this is kind of the big picture argument of the book. There really is a tertium quid, a distinctively reformed alternative to traditional Catholicism on the one side and modern neo-orthodoxy, modern theology, modernism
Yeah.
on the other side. And my hope is that the readers of this volume will be able to appreciate that and understand why they're reformed, confessionally reformed, in a way that Van Til has mapped out following the great minds, I think, in our tradition: Augustine, Calvin, Old Princeton, Old Amsterdam.
Yeah.
He's really just trying to restate this in the sharpest relief to the backdoor mutualism of Rome, the front door mutualism of Mark.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I love bringing up. I love what you said about perichoresis because for the Roman Catholic listeners, and those who are leaning that way, they might think, well, look, you took away the beatific vision from me. I don't get to participate in the divine in that way that I thought was so cool. But then you give us what you've taken away with one hand, you've given us back with perichoresis, because it's not that God could have. I don't know about could. I don't want to make modal statements, but
Sure,
it's
sure.
not that God, created us and then had to give us grace in order for us to have this relationship with Him. No, He created us, and because of perichoresis, because of that, like, we are just in this covenantal relationship with God. It's this elevation back up, but just not past the point of creature distinction. It's as
Yes.
high as you can go, which is fantastic.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's the full the reform view is the full creaturely actualizing of
Mm,
what was concreated in image endowment and advanceable by covenant.
mm, yeah.
And it's glorious. It's a cat, and Westminster Confession, I think 26:3 distinguishes participation of the essence on the one side,
Mm,
partaking of the substance from covenantal communion with persons,
yeah.
Trinitarian persons in Christ.
Yeah. Well, so one follow up on that, and then I'll let you go here. This has been so good. I wonder if so in our doctrine of the Trinity here, we have these three incommunicable attributes: unbegottenness of the Father, begottenness of the Son, procession of the Spirit. When you think about like the high octane uh, uh, to, uh, Thomistic view of simplicity. It's like everything that's in God is God. There's no real distinction among the attributes. They're all one. There's only conceptual differences, um, and that's on our side. Do we? Does this view of the Trinity necessitate a different view of simplicity? Because not all the attributes are one, because we have these three incommunicable ones, and we actually need those in order to differentiate the different persons of the Trinity. What do you make of that of
Well, I,
simplicity? Yeah, in
no,
light of that.
that's really really helpful. I have not been able to find an objection to the strong doctrine of simplicity that you find in Augustine or Thomas. This isn't a unique. This strong doctrine of simplicity is something you find in Augustine.
Mm,
It's something you find in Aquinas. It's something that you find in Calvin, Bavinck, and Van Til is extremely robust in his doctrine of divine simplicity. And I haven't seen, for instance, I've got a dear friend, James Dolezal,
yeah.
who can affirm this strong doctrine of simplicity, which, by the way, so many ostensible Van Tilians just deny simplicity, deny immutability, deny impassibility. It's tragic.
Mm,
James affirms that, but he also affirms these incommunicable personal properties. So I'll tell you where my concern with Thomas on simplicity lies. It's not that he affirms it.
okay.
I think he should be commended for affirming it. I think it's critical that we affirm a robust doctrine of simplicity. The concern that I have is the natural theological method by which he seeks to arrive at that doctrine of simplicity,
Mm,
moving from from natural reason, the inner light of reason, does not have as concreated and naturally implanted the knowledge of God, and therefore must move from sensible objects through an inferential process to arrive at a conception
yeah.
of simplicity or immutability, which makes that conception dependent upon a kind of rational and inferential process, whereas Calvin and the Reformed tradition have argued very rigorously that the knowledge of God, Romans 1, his eternal attributes, who he is revealed to all, so that from the outset of knowing self, the image bearer knows God, his
Yeah.
eternal power and divine attributes. They have been clearly seen, clearly made known in them, in autois, in them. And so, I think I'll put it this way. Dr. Scott Oliphant, Professor Frame, uh, as Van Tillians, they cannot give an unqualified doctrine of divine simplicity.
Hmm.
Frame affirms a second mode of historical existence. I have it in a footnote in the book.
Yeah.
Oliphant affirms a covenantal mind. He affirms God lacks power covenantally. He affirms that God is ignorant of the future covenantally. He's got a full orb dialectic between essential and covenantal properties, and he ascribes a whole host of created properties prior to the incarnation to God and calls them covenantal.
Hmm.
That is not classically reformed. It's not even creedal.
Hmm.
Those views. Those are denials of what I call unqualified simplicity. So those who affirm unqualified simplicity, I think, are friends of creedal orthodoxy and classically reformed orthodoxy.
Hmm.
And I think the question starts to become with as we start to fine tune that debate more, how do we arrive at our doctrine of simplicity, our doctrine of immutability, our doctrine of impassibility, and how do those attributes of God relate to the Trinitarian processions? And then how does the creature relate to the essence of God in nature and in grace?
Yeah.
And I think so. I think with Thomas, I view it this way, and I'll be brief here, Parker.
Yeah.
Just like with Lutherans, we can affirm a catechetical definition of justification. We can say that we agree with Lutherans that that justification is the imputation of the righteousness of Christ. Where do
Hmm.
we disagree? Well, we disagree with them on how it relates to a theology of union with Christ.
Yeah.
They want to place it as the alpha point for union. We want to see it as a facet of union, something that manifests union.
Hmm.
So we have a different, we can agree on a kind of catechetical definition, but in terms of its theological function in a system,
Yeah.
there's great difference.
Sure.
Similar here on simplicity. I can agree with Thomas and laud him, especially over these deniers of simplicity. And once God reveals himself, he's composite, he's mutable, he's ignorant, he's got a covenantal mind, he's historical. Those are that belongs more in, that's in the Socinian or open theist tradition, not a reformed.
Hmm.
But but with Thomas, so I want to affirm what Thomas is saying, but the issue is not whether we can agree on the catechetical definition. It's more on the methodological and systematic implications
Yeah.
of how that doctrine functions.
Yeah. What work it's doing in the system.
Yeah.
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 Totally. Man, that's really helpful. I've been thinking a lot about the authorial analogy for the God-world relation. That God interacts with the world in a analogous situation, an analogous case to an author, and I'm trying to think through whether that can help us with Professor Frame and Dr. Oliphant's view, and saying, like, C.S. Lewis wrote The Great Divorce, but C.S. Lewis in Oxford didn't change, but C.S. Lewis as a character in there was talking to different characters. I don't know. That's a whole huge project, and maybe we can all get together on it someday. But Dr. Tipton, I want to thank you so much for the work here that you've done in going back into the dissertation and making it a book for us. I commend this book, and I really appreciate what I really appreciate about you is that you take the historical doctrines and you give theological reasons for them, instead of just saying, but that's what the old folks used to say, that's history. That's a good reason, but there's more that can be said, and I
Yeah.
really appreciate that you do that as a systematician.
Thanks.
And sometimes it's a critique I have for the historical folks, that they go,
No,
well,
I,
he
I
said it, so
appreciate
you have
that.
to. Yeah.
I appreciate that, brother. One quick thing on the Cambridge change thesis.
Yeah.
On the Frame and Oliphant material, just remember that Oliphant says God literally
Yeah,
changes,
I know. Yeah.
literally is ignorant, literally lacks knowledge in the relation. And Frame says he literally has historical existence and befores and afters. So I
Mhm.
don't think the Cambridge change is going to do the heavy lifting on that. We should just the best way to think of it, just the briefest way to put it, is that Reformed confessional theology affirms an unqualified doctrine of simplicity and immutability ad intra and ad extra.
Mm.
That's the best way to think about it. But brother, thanks for having me
Yeah.
on, and it's a delight to be on here. And pray that your work continues to prosper, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Again, folks, the book is The Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til by Dr. Lane Tipton, and it's you can find it, I believe, at reformforum.org. But I'll put a link in the description to the book so y'all can get that really easily. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.